So without much ado, let me start sharing my screen. Are you seeing my screen, Calvin?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I've created a few sample emails. So I'll start with the Visual Studio first. All right, so we are in the visual editor. Now, before I go into the details, as you can see, we have changed the look and feel of this studio. But along with it, you can also see that you have access to the left menu and the top menu from the studio itself. So in case you need to access any other feature on the Blueshift platform, you can do so. Well, that uh, being said, let me now dive into the studio organization itself, right? So every email studio now has three tabs: the properties tab, the content tab, data tab, test send tab, and engagement tab. And I will be going through each of these tabs in one by one. So starting with the properties tab. So properties tab is where you find all the non-content related information, right? So this is where you have the name. You can update the name. You have like a little bit of information on like what the studio is for. So this is a template, not a layout. You're in the visual editor, so that information is shared with you. Then you also see the version information, right? So what version you're looking at, what time it was saved, who it was edited by, if there are any version notes on notes that you can refer to, and you also have a link to compare versions. But more about versioning in a bit, right? Let's go through the other items. You can update tags. You can see if you're using any shared or reusable assets in this template. And then the next section is something to note about. So this is where all the settings for campaign behavior can be found. So settings like if you don't want to send the email to users if any of the products in the recommendation block or the recommendation block is empty, for instance, or if you're using external fetch in your content and external fetch doesn't return any results. Similarly with events, if you are using an event which doesn't have products. So these settings previously used to be scattered all over our studio, but now they have been consolidated in the properties tab. And then the final thing is, you have a list of all the campaigns where this template is being used. You can see, the status of the campaigns and so on. You also have access to the preview on the right-hand side, but the preview for the email is available on all the tabs, and I'll cover it in a bit, right? So that's properties tab in a nutshell. Now, once you've started creating your email studio, you've defined all the properties. The next step for you would be to add content to it. Right. So the content tab is where you have access to all the visual components which you can drag and drop to create your content, right? So this remains largely unchanged. But you'll notice that we now have a subject here. So you can come here, you can update the subject, and as you do it, you'll see the preview being rendered just below it, right? So it's not just the subject that you have access to. For the first time, we have also provided you with a dedicated input for the pre-header text. And we decided that the best place for all of this is the content tab, because all of this is part of your content. And we've heard from some of you that having the information scattered everywhere kind of makes you forget to update the subject or pre-header text, for instance, right? So we tried to bring everything together in one tab, and here it is. Another point I want to note is that whether you're using the subject line or the pre-header line, you have access to all the liquid merge tags. So for you to invoke the liquid merge tags, you have to use the curly brackets, right? And let's say I'm going to choose user from this drop-down list, and I'm going to say use the first name, and voila. So now you can see I use user.firstname, and here is my preview for this. And the same for the pre-header text too. So I'm going to do user, maybe now I'll do user dot last name, and voila. If I click anywhere outside, the subject line collapses, so now I have a little more space for composing the body of my email. And in the body too, you have access to all the liquid variables as before. But unlike the subject line, where it's a little more intuitive and easy to use, whereas I showed you it's a drop down, in here you have to use the merge tags option from this toolbar. And if I click on merge tags, you have access to all the different user attributes, etc., that you can access. All right. So that is our content tab. Calvin, just wanted to pause for a second and see if there are any questions based on what I've covered so far.
None yet, Shobik.
Okay, cool. So I'll keep going. So now that I've been like composing my email with like all the user content, etc. I may actually feel like well, I need to add a little more something extra to this email. What about a recommendation algorithm, right? What about adding some recommended products? Where do I add that from? Well, so that and more can be found under the data tab. So in the data tab, we've consolidated all these additional data elements that you can include in an email template. So, whether it's a recommendation, external fetch, or it's a sample event, right? So let's start. Let's take a look at.
Hey, Shobik. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but we did get one question.
Yeah.
And that question is, can we still update the subject at the campaign level?
That is correct, right? So we haven't changed any of the functionality. The thing is, the subject for the email template remains, attached to the email template. But at the campaign level, you can decide to override it. So that's essentially what the campaign level setting does, and that will still continue to be the case. Cool. Okay.
Great. Thanks.
So going back to it. So here in the data tab, you have access to all the additional data elements. So let's say, you want to add a recommendation, you click on it, so if you use the Email Studio before, you'll know that the recommendation selector used to be an infinite drop-down list. So you'd have to know the name of the recommendation and actually scroll through the entire long list before you found what you were looking for. Well, in the new studio, you don't need to do that anymore because it's not only a drop-down, but it's also searchable. So if I'm looking for something, I can start searching, and it basically shows all the recommendations that match the name that I'm looking for. The external fetch, it's the same as before. You can always add content from an API into your email. And then sample event, right? So if you are creating an email for an event triggered campaign and you want to use some of the attributes of that event in your email content, that's when you use or include a sample event JSON in this area, right? Now, you can continue to add a JSON if you desire, but we've also given you the option to select an event or search for an event from this drop-down list. And if you do that, what it'll do is it'll automatically populate the sample event JSON for you. So you don't have to go to multiple places, search for an event, look for, copy the JSON and, come back to the studio to paste it, right? So it's all readily available in like one single place inside the studio. All right. So let's say, now we are done adding all this additional content. We may want to figure out like how to access this content via liquid merge tags in our email body or subject line, for instance. So we used to have the JSON object with the entire data payload, and we continue to have it here. This may seem like, oh, it's a small area for you to view it. Well, this is adjustable, so you can always increase the screen size. You can go through the objects that are of interest to you, and you can basically drill down to see what the exact attributes are, so that you can use them in your content. But you don't have to necessarily go through the JSON object, because as I showed you earlier, right, like whenever you're using liquid merge tags, you also have access to all these external extended and default attributes if you want. It's all available there. But there's an additional area where you can find these attributes if you so want to. Cool. So let's hide this. The next thing is, once you've added all your content, you would like to preview it, right? And the first thing about previewing is you want to find a user for previewing your content. And if you remember what you had to do in the older studio, you would have to go find a user from the customer attributes feature, then go to their profile page, copy their email address, and paste it in the studio. Well, we've actually removed all of that. You don't have to go outside the studio at all. If you want to search for a user who meets your criteria, you can do so right here. So if you click on this, you can see there is a search bar available to you. And I can specify my search criteria here. And it returns the search results within the studio itself. And I may go through the list and select like one user to preview my content with. So as you see, like the moment I previewed, a moment I selected this user, the preview changed, right? So it's pretty simple to preview with a user within the studio now.
Hey, Shobhit.
Yeah.
We have a few questions coming in, so I just want to do a quick pause. So the first question is, where can the raw email HTML be edited if the current customer is not using the WYSIWYG editor?
Cool. So that will be in the HTML studio, and I'm going to go through it towards the end of the webinar. The workflow that I'm showing is going to be the same, whether it's HTML Studio or the visual editor. The only difference is that instead of using the WYSIWYG editor, you enter the raw HTML, plain text, AMP, whatever content you want to. But everything else that I'm showing here is applicable to both the studios.
Great, thanks. And then another question that popped up that pertains to previewing is, are customers able to preview content with attributes other than an email address?
Yes, good question. So let me just show you, right? So this one is a search, right? And it says matching certain attributes, and email address is of course selected by default, but you have access to all the other customer attributes, whether you want to search by customer ID, phone number, or any other special attribute. You can still create your query, run the search, and it will return the results, and you can use those results to preview your content.
Great, cool. Thank you.
All right. So so now we have previewed the content with one user. You may want to actually preview it with multiple users, right? So in the previous studio, if you had to do it, you would have to repeat the entire set of steps all over again, right? Go to the customer attribute search for another user, copy their email address, and paste it here. Well, here, you don't really need to do it. If you run a search which returns multiple customers, all you need to do is now scroll through this list of users using the next and previous button. So let me, try it out, right? So I click on the next customer, and voila, the names change. It's John 2 now, right? I click next, and it's previewing for John 3, right? And so on, right? So I can keep scrolling through users and see the updated previews for this user. Cool. The next thing you may want to do is, like, maybe you don't want to search by user attributes, but you want to search for users who are in a certain segment, right? So you can do that here, and I can, type in a segment name. Here's a segment which I've created, and I can choose one of the users from the segment, and the preview renders for that user. And I also have access to the same next and previous buttons, so I can keep scrolling through multiple users in the segment and see how the preview renders for those users. Cool.
Hey, we have a few other questions coming in.
Sure.
One is it possible to use multiple values or attributes in the search user function?
Unfortunately, at this point, no. It's just a single value. It's the same search experience that you have on the customer attributes screen. So we've just brought feature parity to both the searches. But once we start supporting multiple attributes on the customer attribute search, you should be able to leverage that feature within the studio as well.
Great. Cool. And then just one more additional question. And this is going back to the properties tab. Mm-hmm. Do both HTML and visual builders have layouts that can be user defined?
So right now, only the HTML editor has layouts which are user defined. We don't support that for Visual Studio yet. But that's in our backlog. We'll try to get to it at some time.
Great. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. So we just talked about, how to preview with different users, right? So the next thing is to see, how your preview looks like on different screen sizes. If you notice, the default preview now is for the mobile screen size. And the reason we decided to do it is because, most of our users are on the mobile these days, and a mobile device is the most likely device where they'll be seeing your email, right? So that's the default preview. But if you want, you can preview this content for other aspect ratios too. So you can preview it for a tablet or a desktop, right? Now, if you want to see how responsive your content is, apart from choosing these 3 aspect ratios, you can also choose responsive mode. And when you select this mode, you'll notice that a slider appears on the left-hand side of the preview, and you can basically adjust the size to see how responsive your content is, right? And another thing about the previews, which I kind of implicitly showcased earlier, is that when you're previewing your email, it's not only the email body that you're getting to see now, you're getting to see the subject line and the pre-header line as well. So all your previews are in one place, and you can easily search for users. You can check the previews in different screen sizes and see the previews for all your content in one location. All right. So now that you have previewed it, you're more or less satisfied with everything that you see on the platform, but you still want to send yourself a test email just to make sure that everything looks all right in your real device, right? So you can do that. You can still do that, and you have access to that in the test send tab. The test send functionality is largely the same as before. You can like specify the email addresses where you want to send the test email to, and what it'll do is it'll send the preview that you're seeing. So essentially, for the preview user that you've selected, it will send this content as a test email to the email addresses you specified here. Great. All right. So now, we've kind of gone through this email template journey. We've created it, added content, previewed it, and tested it. Now we are super excited. We want to launch it in a campaign. And what do? We go to the campaigns tab, right? But wait a second. I made a lot of changes, but I haven't saved it yet. And you know what happened in the last studio. If you exited the studio by accident without saving your changes were gone, right? It's happened to me, it's happened to a lot of you, and when it happens, it's super frustrating. Let's see what happens in the new studio, right? The moment you try to exit away from the studio to any other part of the app, or just exit the template itself, and the template knows that there are unsaved changes, it will give you an alert, right? So there's going to be no way that you'll accidentally quit your changes, right? The only way to do it is if you intend to discard all the changes, right? So in this case, I'm not going to quit. I'm going to continue editing, right? Because I want to save my changes before I launch my campaign. So I can save my changes by clicking on the save button, of course, but you'll see a drop-down arrow right next to the save button now. And if you click on it, what it'll do is it'll give you a prompt to describe all the changes you made, right? So this is kind of like a change log for yourself, right? So I can say, I updated subject line, maybe to updated pre-header text, and so on, right? And I add my content, and then I save, right? You see, this was the version that was saved before, right? Version 11 on December 7th from me. Now, once it saves, right, it's successfully saved, you see now the version number has gone up. It's now version 12, and it's saved at 9:26 a.m., right? So this is where you get to see all the latest version information, and what we do is every time you save changes, whether you save just directly by the save button or you add a note to your changes, we create a new version. And all of this is available via like any standard versioning or document control system. And you can access it from this link at the top of the studio or from the one that I had showed earlier in the properties tab. So there is a compare version here, or there is a version history button, right? So I'm going to click on this. I'm going to show you what happens, right? So when you are in the version comparison area, it'll compare the most current version, which is still being edited, right, with the most recently saved version, right? And you can see the differences. So let me, since the most current version is also the most recent version, let me just go to the previous version, right? And as you can see here, there are two tabs. There's preview and metadata, right? So I'm seeing the comparison of the two versions right now. So for instance, the subject line has changed. I can see the pre-header has changed, and so on. And I can also go to the preview tab and see if if there are any differences in the previews, right? So I can basically compare different versions and see what was there, right? And if I have broken something while adding some changes to this template, and I want to revert to an earlier version, I can easily do so. So for instance, I'm looking at this version from 4th of December. I want to edit, I want to restore to this version. All I need to do is I need to click on the restore button. So when I do this, what it will do is it'll create a new version for you. So version 12 will become version 13. And this new version will basically say that it was restored from the earlier version. So let's just do that to take a look at. Um, so when I do that, I get a prompt that will replace this current template and any any campaign that's using this template will get updated with all the changes. Do I want to continue? And I'll say yes. So when I do, it gives a confirmation that I've restored the earlier version, and as you can see here, the version summary gets updated to restore to version 2, and it's a new version that we are seeing here. Cool. I think there's a question.
Yep. Hey, so I guess a question that just came in. Have there been any improvements to using recommended products in the content blocks, such as looping through products in a multi-column layout?
No, unfortunately, like most of the changes to the studio are like, the functional changes that I'm talking about, menu organization and like productivity related changes. We haven't made any changes to our recommendation blocks yet. Cool. Okay. So we talked about versioning, right? Now we have everything saved and we go and launch a campaign, right? And we are using this email in a campaign. So then we would like to see how users are actually engaging with this email, right? Like what aspects of this email are interesting to the users, what are not, where are users clicking on this email. So all of this information can be answered if you go to the engagement tab. Engagement tab is where you can see a heat map of all the clicks that have been happening on your email template, right? And everything is color coded, and you can see, like which clickable elements users have been clicking on, which are the most popular items here. So a few things to note is that, you have the heat map in a visual form on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, you have access to the same thing, but in a tabular fashion. If you look at the table, you'll see that there are multiple instances of the same URL. And that's the case, right? So for instance, blueshift.com appears in link index 1, and it also appears in link index 2. And we track the counts for each of these instances separately, right? So here you see index 1, that's where the first occurrence of blueshift.com is, and this is index 2, where the second occurrence is, and we can track it separately, right? And if this is useful to you, this is great. But if you just want to see how the links stack up for every individual or unique URL, you can still do it by clicking the aggregate hrefs checkbox here. So it will basically aggregate all the clicks for each unique URL if you so desire, right? In addition to it, you can download the report as a CSV if you want to export it to Excel or use the numbers elsewhere. Also note that there are some filters over here. The heat maps that you see are specific to the version of the email. So if you have a different version, you can see how that version of the email has performed. You can also choose between clicks and unique clicks. So you get whatever is important to you. And you can also play with the timeline to see the clicks over a certain period of time. Another thing to note is that when you are seeing the heat map, it's being rendered on the preview for this specific user. In case you are using dynamic content, like an if else statement or a recommendation block, that content may not be rendered for the specific user. So we do recommend that when you are checking the heat map, you check it out for multiple different users. You should scroll through the different users when you are checking the heat map so that you can make sure that you are seeing how each and every dynamic block is covered, right? Now, although the dynamic block is not rendered or may not be rendered for a specific user in the preview, it'll still show up on the table here. So the table is going to be a fully exhaustive list of all links, whereas the preview is going to be custom for the user you're previewing with. Cool. I see there are a bunch of questions. I'm going to pause and I'm going to try to go through the questions. Go ahead, Calvin.
Yeah, great. So for the heat map, will clients be able to look at clicks retroactively, or is it only from now on?
So we have enabled heat maps from like early, let me see, like maybe around a month ago in the backend, right? So it should, so the data should be available for at least like a month now. But anything before that, we don't have any data. So you won't be able to do it. And anything going forward, yes, of course. But you'll have access to like almost a month of data that we've been collecting in the backend for the heat map feature.
Great, thank you. So for the next question, are clients able to download the image version of the heat map?
Right now, no. You'll have to use a screenshotting tool to kind of go through it. We do not have a PNG or any other export functionality yet.
Okay, great. And then another question is, will we be able to view the heat map data at the campaign level, not just for the overall creative?
So no, because the heat map is for the template. We do not have a campaign level filter in the heat map. Maybe we can add that to our backlog as an enhancement request, so that along with like time filters, you may be able to also filter by a specific campaign that used the template. Right now, it is aggregated across all campaigns that are using this template. Great.
And then just kind of to piggyback off of your response there, is there a version of the heat map that will show all user click data that's aggregated together?
I don't understand that question. It's all user, like you mean across all versions? Yeah, so we don't do a heat map across all versions. And the reason being, it wouldn't be an apples to apples comparison, right? Because in a version, you may add a new element to it, or you may remove an element from the template. And if you do so, and you're trying to compare the click on a new element with elements which have been there from the past, it doesn't give you a clear picture of which element is more popular with respect to everything else. So in order to do that, like all our heat maps are version controlled, and you can only see them for specific versions, but not across all versions.
Okay, great. And it looks like we have time for just one more question. Is it possible to create a report of the click heat map and export that via PDF or using some sort of insight report?
Well, so there's no PDF version of it, but you can download this as a CSV, as I said. So and once it's a CSV, you can do whatever you want to do with it. Cool. Cool. So the heat map, it's available under the engagement tab. Now it's also available directly from the index screen. So as I do that, I just wanted to point out that, the back button is right here at the top. So it's not the collapse button, which used to be confusing. We've kind of replaced that. So we have a more prominent back button. So you can click to go back to the index screen. And then from the index screen, You can also access the heat map. You'll see there's the engagement report right below click report, right? And this will take you directly to the heat map for that email template. One point that I want to make regarding the click report is that the engagement report has everything that the click report had, and it had and has more than that, right? So we are going to eventually phase out click report, and we would strongly urge you to start using the engagement report going forward instead of the click report. Cool. So we've kind of gone through like the entire flow for the Visual Studio. The next thing that I want to showcase is how you can make like create one subject and reuse it in multiple email templates. For instance, if you have a lot of dynamic content in your subject line, you don't want to like copy paste or edit it in multiple different email templates. How do you do it? So here, if you go to shared assets, you'll see that we have added like a new type, right? So there's the type which shows it's a subject or HTML, for instance, right? So let's click on one of the shared assets. And here, when you're defining the shared asset, you can choose whether you want this is an HTML shared asset, rich text, or subject line. So in this case, I've defined it as a subject line shared asset, right? And this is my subject line, for instance. And I want to use this shared asset in my email template instead of writing the subject line there, right? So I need the reference string for this shared asset. Since I was on the visual editor, I'll use the visual editor reference string from here, right? And now I'm going to go back to my email studio. I'm going to go back to my visual editor, go to the content tab, and instead of using the static subject, I'm just going to use the shared asset, and voila, right? Now you can see that the subject has changed. It's basically using the one that's defined in the shared asset, right? And if I hide the details, it's the same in the preview here. So that's how you can use a subject line type shared asset going forward. Cool. So I don't want to save my changes. I'm going to pause for a second. Were there any additional questions, Calvin?
There were no additional questions, Shepard.
Cool. All right. So that brings me to the final item in my agenda, which is to walk through the HTML studio. And as I had mentioned before, the workflow and all the features that I showcase for the Visual Studio is the same for the HTML Studio. So you still have the same 5 tabs, which I walked you through, have like, the same setup. Under the Properties tab, the Content tab is, of course, different. Instead of the visual drag and drop builder, you now have the source code editor for HTML or plain text or AMP. So you can write in your HTML right here. But everything else regarding previews, adding additional data, doing test sends, checking the engagement report, doing a version comparison, all of this are the same. So, if you know how to use one of the studios, you should be able to use the other studio as long as you can, you're comfortable coding with HTML. So that brings me to the end of my agenda. So I'm going to pass the ball back to you, Calvin. Calvin, you're muted.
One second.
Yes, I can hear you now. Cool.
Great. Okay. So, as we wrap up this product webinar, I'd like to open it up to any questions folks may have. Great. And the first one that came in, when are these updates being pushed live to our accounts? So all of these new enhancements will be released during tomorrow's release. We will share release notes and documentation first thing Wednesday morning as well. So you can expect to have all of that in your inbox December 9th.
Cool. Yeah, and I think we will also include a copy of or a link to a recording of today's webinar somewhere in the release notes. So in case you want to reference what we covered, you should have access to it as well.
Yes, exactly. And feel free to share this recording with your team if they would like to reference it as well.
Right. And we are also planning to do an office hour session sometime in the near future. So if you have any questions as you are starting to use the new studios, you want to clarify your questions or any doubts, you can join in the office hour and I'll be present and I'll be there to answer any questions that you may have.
Yes, and to add to what Shobik just mentioned, we will share that information here shortly as well, so the folks that want to attend can. Okay, looks like there's no more questions and we're at time. So once again, thank you all for jumping on today's product webinar. We're excited for this release and hope you guys are too. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.